Hey guys, I'm Tom the Tech Chap, and this is pretty special actually. It's the first in a whole new breed of MacBook. Although from the outside you wouldn't really be able to tell because it's actually virtually identical, here's one I made earlier, to a regular MacBook Pro 13. The main difference between these two is this is powered by a Intel 10th generation i5 processor, whereas this one has Apple's new M1 chip in it. So this, along with the new MacBook Air, is our very first taste of Apple silicon in a laptop, which, you know what, tastes absolutely incredible, which, as I say it out loud, is a bit of a weird metaphor. So there's a ton of questions around the M1, and I even spent half an hour talking to a couple of Apple's vice presidents the other day all about it. But now I've had about a week with this, so I've been able to test it. Honestly, as cringy as it is, the only word to describe the M1 MacBook is revolutionary. It really is. Let me explain, and if we start with the battery life, and to compare it, I'll bring back the Intel MacBook Pro 13 here. This is still the 2020 model. It's got the i5. This is actually the 4 Thunderbolt port model. This is the 2. Both have updated to Big Sur. Brightness is measured at 150 nits. Basically, they're set up exactly the same. So I set them off going through one of my playlists on YouTube, and after an hour, the Intel had 81% battery left versus 91% on the M1. Then, after an hour-long Zoom call, the Intel is down to 51% versus 77% on the M1, which is pretty crazy. And finally, I jumped into a bit of Shadow of the Tomb Raider. I was planning to run this for an hour as well, but at the 40-minute mark, the Intel model ran out of battery. With the M1, wait for it, still on 47%. That's absolutely incredible, and it backs up Apple's claims that we're basically getting double the battery life with this thing. When was the last time we've had a new laptop that offered that kind of an upgrade? Now, of course, it all comes down to how you use it, but YouTube, Zoom, and gaming is pretty varied, and consistently the M1 model was only dropping by half as much as the Intel. It's funny, I actually asked Apple in my interview with them, I said, have you managed to put a bigger battery in here? Because, you know, you've put the CPU, the GPU, the neural engine, all that stuff into the one SoC, the M1, the 5nm chip. They said, no, it's the exact same battery size as before, which means all those battery upgrades are purely down to the efficiency of the M1, which is pretty crazy, but maybe not so surprising when you consider, you know, the A12s, 13s, and 14s that we've had in iPhones and iPads recently. The performance, the battery life has been incredible. And of course, they've been working within like a 2-watt power consumption constraint here in a tiny fanless device. Scale it up to a laptop size with a fan, bigger battery, and of course, upping the TDP. We're finally getting that iPhone and iPad level of performance and efficiency in a MacBook. So to be honest, we could stop there. The battery life improvements alone would make the M1 version of this pretty exciting and probably worth the upgrade, but that's just the start. So let's talk about performance. And again, I want to bring back in the Intel MacBook Pro 13 and also the new Dell XPS 13. This is the 9300 model, which comes with Intel's latest 11th gen Tiger Lake CPUs, which of course also come with a much faster Xe integrated graphics. This is going to be pretty interesting. So let's kick off with a few benchmarks, and in the new Cinebench R23 test, the M1 is 40% faster in single core and 60% faster in multi-core than the Intel MacBook, with similar boosts versus the XPS 13. In Geekbench 5, starting with the CPU, and we're looking at a 12% faster single core and 35% faster multi-core versus the Intel MacBook. So not as big of a jump here, and actually the XPS 13 wins in single core, and it's not too far behind in multi-core. But the thing is, this test isn't really optimized for the M1, and in fact, on the M1 MacBook I've got here, you can actually select between Intel and now Apple Silicon testing. And so if I bring those scores in, clearly it's a lot higher. Although now we are looking at two slightly differently optimized tests, so the results aren't fully comparable. But even in the Intel optimized test, the M1 is still the clear winner in multi-core, even against the XPS 13, which is pretty impressive. Now then, moving on to graphics, and again, if we start with Geekbench, here are the results of the OpenCL and the Metal tests side by side. And holy moly, look at those numbers! In both, the M1 MacBook is over twice as fast as the Intel MacBook, although clearly the Xe graphics in the XPS 13 is giving the M1 some strong competition. So it's pretty clear that the M1 MacBook is a lot faster than the Intel MacBook, but it's a little tricky when comparing it to a Windows equivalent like the XPS 13 here, because kind of like Android phones and iPhones, the hardware isn't exactly the same, and also the apps and programs have been optimized and developed differently. So for the rest of the video, I kind of want to focus on the two MacBooks because you do still have the option on Apple Store between the M1 and the Intel MacBook Pro 13. Now, obviously gaming isn't exactly a strong suit for Macs, and whether you're on Intel or M1, we're still pretty limited in what games are supported on the Mac. However, if we jump into Shadow of the Tomb Raider at Full HD with high settings, which is quite ambitious, the Intel MacBook returns an 11 FPS average versus a 23 FPS average on the M1. That's over double the frame rate, although you'd probably want to drop a few settings to make it actually playable. Let's try one more game, and we've got Total War 3 Kingdoms running here, and again at Full HD with high settings to keep things consistent. Now, I did notice some texture issues running the game on the M1, but in terms of performance, the Intel MacBook averaged 8.9 frames per second, whereas the M1 averages 19 FPS. So again, like Tomb Raider, the M1 is twice as fast here. But you know what's really incredible is that neither of those games are universal apps. They're running on the Rosetta 2 emulator. They haven't had any optimizations or updates for the M1, and yet we're still seeing double the performance of the Intel machine. Okay, one last test. Let's have a look at video editing. I'm starting with Final Cut Pro because, of course, all of Apple's own apps, whether it's Final Cut, Logic, Pages, Numbers, Mail, etc., they're all universal and fully optimized for the M1. So, in my test of a 10-minute 4K 60 export in Final Cut, the Intel took 13 minutes and 12 seconds to render compared to 8 minutes and 18 seconds on the M1. That's 60% faster. Perhaps I thought we'd see a bigger boost considering this is M1 optimized, given the benchmark and gaming results, but 60% faster, knocking 5 minutes off a 10-minute video render is still pretty impressive. But what about Adobe Premiere Pro? It is of course far less optimized than Final Cut on the Mac, but it's the editor I usually use. So with the exact same test, it took 23 minutes and 37 seconds on the Intel MacBook versus 18 minutes and 30 seconds on the M1. That's 25% faster. And again, this is a Rosetta app. None of the Adobe suite currently has a proper M1 Universal App update, although I think Lightroom is coming in December with Photoshop and some of those coming early next year. One thing I did notice during my testing is that the M1 MacBook was almost silent throughout. Just listen to this. This is the Intel MacBook running Cinebench. Then if we switch over to the M1, also running Cinebench, it's absolutely silent. I feel like I wouldn't even mind if it whirred up a little bit if we got even better performance, but dead silent. So of course the big upgrade with the new M1 MacBook is the M1 chip, but we're also getting things like Wi-Fi 6 and USB 4 ports, although they're still Thunderbolt 3. We also get studio microphones, but hopefully you should also be able to see another difference, the quality of the webcam. So this is the Intel, and then this is the M1. And it's actually the same resolution, the same sensor, but just with the new ISP on the M1 chip, we get more accurate white balance, faster autofocus and exposure, and just side by side, even me looking at these screens now, it is quite a lot better. So obviously in this crazy world that we live in, quality of your web calls is quite important. So there's a nice little upgrade actually. But still, one of the biggest questions about the transition to an M1 MacBook is how well will my apps work and what's the performance going to be like? Well, so far, as we've seen, the performance is incredible. And in every test, the M1, even running Rosetta apps, has significantly outperformed the 10th gen Intel model. Although the slightly more powerful and more expensive Intel i7 would narrow the gap slightly, but not by much, and actually wouldn't make any difference when it comes to the graphics. But most importantly, so far at least, touch wood, I've not had any trouble running the apps that I want to on this. Everything seems to work. The Adobe suite, Stream, Discord, Slack, Zoom, WebEx. But if you are thinking, how do I even know if the app I'm using is running with Rosetta and still optimized for Intel, or is universal and is supported and optimized for the M1? Well, it's a little bit tricky. In the App Store, it might be mentioned as part of updates or patch notes, but the best way I found is to go into the activity monitor and see if the architecture says Intel or Apple. Ideally, you shouldn't even need to worry about this, and as we've seen, the performance even running on Intel architecture through Rosetta is absolutely fine. But going forward, as developers update their apps, more and more will use the Apple architecture. Plus, we're only just starting to see the real benefits of machine learning. I mean, right now there's a few demos like you can do the Smart Select in Photoshop, which is apparently 8 times faster on the M1, or the Smart Conform feature in Final Cut, which can change the aspect ratio of your video and then intelligently follow the subject. So there are some benefits to machine learning now, but really it's about what developers are going to be able to do with it going forward. It's pretty exciting. Now you thought that was going to be it, we were at the end, but no, there's another big advantage of the M1 paired with a Big Sur update, and that's the ability to play iOS and iPadOS apps on your Mac, which in theory is a pretty big deal. And as you can see, we now have the option between Mac apps and iPhone and iPad apps. The trouble is, there isn't really that many available. It doesn't really have most of the good apps. For example, there's no Instagram or Snapchat, TikTok, Uber, PUBG, or COD Mobile on this, for example. I'm sure this will get better with time, although some apps of course won't work at all. Maybe they require the gyroscope or GPS, which we just obviously don't have on a Mac. So I am excited to see how this develops, but for now, iOS apps on your Mac is more of just like a cool extra. So overall, I mean, there's only so many superlatives I can use to describe this thing, and I hope you guys know I was skeptical about the M1 as well. Apple made some crazy claims, but so far, the M1 MacBook is living up to them. And compared to the current 2020 Intel version of the MacBook Pro, it's a no-brainer. We're getting double the performance, double the battery life, with a much quieter fan that can also run some iOS apps, and on top of all that, a better webcam as well. Which begs the question of why would anyone want to buy the Intel version? Well, it's a little tricky, and it comes down to how Apple is pricing these and sort of selling them, because the M1 is only replacing the Intel 2 Thunderbolt port version. The 4-port version, this guy, is still exclusively Intel, which is a bit frustrating and a bit weird. And also the Intel model gives you more RAM and storage expandability, as slightly disappointingly the M1 tops out at 16 gigs of their new unified memory, which I would recommend actually. I have once or twice run into memory limits when you run out of system memory, so I would recommend 16 gigs, but it is a shame for a pro laptop like this that you might want to invest in and have for like 5 years that you can't upgrade to 32 gigs. But still, this is just the start, and I can't wait to see what Apple maybe does with the M2 or maybe the M1Z, whatever it turns out to be, perhaps in the MacBook Pro 16. Because as they say, this is just the start of their 2-year transition away from Intel. But if I were you and going out to buy a new MacBook Pro now, I would 100% go with the M1. I have only had a week with this, so more testing needs to be done, but yeah, first impressions, first review, it's an incredible bit of kit. Thank you so much for watching, guys, and if you do want to see more of me, don't forget to hit that little subscribe button below, and I'll catch you next time right here on the Tech Chat.